Sometimes algebraic functions can be cubic, and it can lead to frustration real quick. Whether you're in a test or working on homework, higher-order polynomials can be highly annoying. However, you just might have to factor in fear being tripled, and situations can curve away into terror. My name is Joey, and way back in high school algebra, I had one of the scariest but also one of the strangest experiences of my life. Now, it wasn't the math per se, but rather something incidentally related to it. This was just after the start of our sophomore year, I think in early October, and our math teacher was Mr. Porter. I didn't particularly like math, but Mr. Porter honestly did a good job of trying to keep things fun and lighthearted, and in a weird way it helped us learn the material. One day in class we started going over cubic functions, which as the name might suggest, have at most an x cubed in them. Specifically, we were talking about how to factor them. I don't want to nerd everyone out, but I'll mention this because it's directly relevant to what happened. Because cubic functions can have up to 4 terms in them, you can use something known as factoring by grouping to help factor them. Mr. Porter told us we had to do skits to show how the numbers and x's would move around while factoring them, and he gave us note cards and pens to write down the numbers and letters. Several students groaned, but as we'd come to learn, these little mini projects weren't bad. And as long as we weren't too loud and got stuff done, Mr. Porter was totally chill. Originally, we could only do it in pairs, but someone asked if we could have groups of 4 since factoring by grouping could use 4 terms. After a moment of thought, Mr. Porter agreed and kids started cheering. I'd been planning to work with my best friend Tony, but now that we could make a bigger group, we needed to pick 2 more people. We didn't really know anyone else in the class, so we randomly asked this one other guy if he wanted to work with us. His name was Lucas, and he ended up being really chill. That left one spot still open. After a few more moments, everyone had made groups of 4, and there was only one odd person out. Lucas went over and asked him if he wanted to join our group, and he readily agreed. That proved to be a fateful decision, but there's no way I can blame Lucas, since none of us knew anything about that kid. Every group went up to get the note cards and permanent markers, and we all pushed the desks together into groups of 4 and sat down. Probably the hardest part of this assignment was coming up with a cubic function that could be factored by grouping. Luckily, somehow, I remembered that you could create a cubic function by multiplying factors together and repeatedly using FOIL. Though to be clear, I probably only remember that because we had been going over it the previous few days. Lucas and Tony snickered a bit, but then we all focused on actually doing the work. Or maybe I should say, all of us except the other kid, whose name was Andrew. Andrew actually insisted that it would be faster to start guessing random cubic functions and then trying to see if they factored. Honestly, that's probably what we would have done if I hadn't remembered the other way, but there was something about how Andrew said it that was off-putting. It's like he was trying to one-up me, but there was something else I couldn't put my finger on. Lucas and Tony watched as I started working things out on paper, and then they started writing the numbers, x's, plus signs, and parentheses on paper too. All the while, Andrew kept raising his voice, trying to get us to stop. Initially we ignored him, but eventually Tony snapped and told him to shut up. Mr. Porter must have heard that, because he looked in our direction, but Andrew actually fell silent, so he looked away. We were all looking at Andrew, and the expression he made was disturbing. None of us knew what to say, and I guess in a kind of truce attempt, Lucas told Andrew we could try another function once we finished what we were doing. Andrew didn't seem to care for that idea, and started making these big exaggerated marks on his paper, though we stayed quiet. 5 minutes later, and Tony, Lucas, and I had everything written out. We were about to start practicing the movements, wherein we'd each hold up some of the cards and then show how the parentheses would come in and factoring by grouping would happen. But before we did that, we knew we needed to check in with Andrew. When I looked at his desk, I saw he'd gone through like 15 pages of paper, just scribbling random cubic functions. I asked him how he was doing, and in a very childish way he grunted and turned away from me. A girl sitting at another table noticed the papers and how Andrew was acting and laughed, but none of us had any idea how far and how quickly things would escalate. Andrew immediately turned around and said, "Shut up," very loudly. The whole class fell silent and Mr. Porter came over. He asked Andrew sternly what happened, and this was one of the only times Mr. Porter had that demeanor. Andrew said the girl was making fun of him for working on the project, and then pointed to us and said we weren't letting him help. Based on the situation, I think Mr. Porter knew none of us were the issue, and he asked Andrew to step outside with him. But instead of doing that, Andrew just started walking very quickly to the door and let himself out. None of us knew what to think. Mr. Porter, of course, went over to the door too and then stepped into the hallway. We could hear him calling out for Andrew to come back, meaning apparently he just left. All of us stayed quiet to listen to what was going on outside, and for a moment all we heard was Mr. Porter walking up and down some of the hallways looking for Andrew. Then suddenly we heard a pair of footsteps running towards the classroom, followed by a scream and another set of footsteps. 2 seconds later, Mr. Porter burst back in and slammed the door behind him. No sooner had he done that than we heard a loud bang on the door, accompanied by a higher-pitched metallic sound. Mr. Porter turned off the lights and told us to be quiet as he grabbed the phone on his desk. The banging continued as we heard Andrew screaming almost incomprehensibly on the other side. Some of the girls started crying, especially when Mr. Porter told the front office staff about how Andrew ran at him with a knife. Luckily, Andrew couldn't hurt anyone, as he couldn't get through the locked door, and our school security guard was able to apprehend him a minute later. When he arrived, Andrew was still right there, just banging on the door and yelling. The guard commanded Andrew to stop and drop the knife, and when he didn't, the guard tackled Andrew and knocked the knife out of his hand. By the time this happened, the entire school was on lockdown. I'm pretty sure almost everyone in the school could hear the screaming anyway. After getting tackled, Andrew eventually fell silent, and he was escorted out of the building after the cops arrived. School was automatically canceled, and each of our parents had to pick us up. Tony, Lucas, and I, as well as Mr. Porter and a few other kids from our class, had to give statements. Honestly, I wasn't afraid, since other than Tony telling Andrew to shut up, none of us had provoked Andrew in any way. Our parents, as well as probably everyone else's parents, were terrified, and my mom insisted I stay home from school the next day. Ultimately, it didn't matter, since Andrew never ended up coming back. Looking back, I wouldn't say I was terrified by the experience, more just surprised. None of us had ever interacted with Andrew before, and so we couldn't predict what would happen. He must have already had issues since he kept the knife in his locker, and I suspect what happened in our class was what finally pushed him over the edge. This whole thing taught me a valuable lesson. You never really know what someone else is dealing with, or when they might snap. Therefore, you should always think twice before belittling or making fun of someone. As for Tony and I, we became good friends with Lucas too, and the rest of high school was pretty sick. And just to think, our friendship, and what happened with Andrew, was directly tied to factoring by grouping. The most terrifying experience I ever had happened after school one day in 8th grade. I'll call our math teacher Miss Donner for the purposes of the story, and she would come up with these extra credit reports we could do. Each one was worth up to 2 percentage points on the next test. Being an overachiever, I tended to do at least one for each test. For the past 2 weeks, we'd been going over cubic functions, that is, a polynomial whose highest term has an x cubed in it. Apparently there's something called Cardano's formula, which is like the quadratic formula, except for cubics. I'll stop nerding everyone out now, but I just want to say that it blew my mind. Miss Donner had folders stapled to a board at the front of her class, with sheets describing each report we could do in their own folder. When I got the sheet for Cardano's formula, I saw we didn't actually have to use it to find specific x values. Instead, we just had to write about what the formula was, who discovered it, why it was important, etc. I took the sheet back to my desk and was able to make some progress on it during class. I also worked on it a bit in another class and realized I had a question, so at the end of the day I went back to Miss Donner's room to ask her. However, even though I walked over immediately after my last class let out, Miss Donner wasn't in her room. This was very unusual of her, as every time I'd gone there after school before, she'd be sitting at her desk. I walked further inside her room and looked around, but she wasn't anywhere. However, I did notice that 2 of the student desks had been turned over and a couple items had toppled over from her own desk. Seeing that, I started to get concerned, but just then I thought I could hear a scream coming from somewhere outside the building. Instinctively, I walked over to one of the windows, and then my heart stopped. There was Miss Donner, being forced into a car by a man with a gun. I didn't know what to do, so I just ran back into the hallway screaming that Miss Donner was in trouble. Luckily, there were still a few other teachers in their classrooms, and when they realized what was going on, they started to panic. Someone must have called the front office because the principal made an announcement that we were going into lockdown mode and for anyone still by the building to come back inside. I assume someone called 911 as well, and a few minutes later cops showed up. Unfortunately, by that time, Miss Donner and the man who had been abducting her were gone. There was a huge scene at the school, with cops running by, students crying, and eventually all of our parents trying to pick us up while being hysterical. My mom was in tears when she came and threw her arms around me, and the car ride back home was very emotional, especially since we didn't know what had happened to Miss Donner. Thank God the story has a happy ending. The next day at school there was an announcement that Miss Donner had been located and was safe. As we'd come to find out later, the man who had abducted Miss Donner was actually her ex-husband, and they were able to track him and Miss Donner down relatively easily. In fact, her ex-husband had taken her back to his apartment while he apparently went in to get supplies before planning to drive somewhere else. The cops arrested him at his apartment, and Miss Donner was found without any physical injuries. That said, I can't even imagine what she went through, and she took about a month of school off. When she finally came back, I knew something had changed about her, but luckily nothing else remotely that horrific happened after that. I can't help but think about this from time to time, including how unreal it felt. That image of Miss Donner being forced into the car at gunpoint will always remain with me. In the end, I'm just glad the police were able to rescue her, and that I had decided to stop by her classroom for help after school that day. This happened back in college, and it was both strange and disturbing to witness. For context, I was taking college algebra, and we were working on polynomials, specifically cubic functions. The material, at least being taught by a professor, was especially tough, and a fair number of people had already dropped the course. I was there with my buddy Justin, and we made a study group with a few other people. That included a guy named Charlie. Our study group started forming around the second week of class, and we'd met fairly regularly since then to work on homework and review for tests. Everyone seemed more or less normal, including Charlie, who was on the quiet side but overall didn't appear to have any issues. However, as the weeks went on, Charlie became even more quiet, barely speaking at all, and at some point seemed to mumble to himself. At first, Justin and I assumed it was just the stress of the college workload getting to him, and we tried to encourage him to get some sleep and relax. I couldn't tell if that had any effect, because eventually Charlie didn't seem to even acknowledge what we were saying. Another thing we noticed was that Charlie's answers would be odd. For instance, one of the questions was, describe the end behavior of the function f of x equals x cubed plus 2x plus 3. Not to get into unnecessary details, but a reasonable answer might have been, the graph goes down on the left side and up on the right side. But Charlie said something like, x's give all the lines all directions, and none of us knew what that even meant. This was the last study group Charlie attended, and while this one guy in our group started to get annoyed with him, I think the rest of us were genuinely worried. After we finished what we needed to, Justin and I asked to speak to Charlie alone. He didn't get up or seem to acknowledge what we said, so we just continued to sit there while everyone else left. Justin asked Charlie how he was feeling, but he didn't respond to that question. So I asked him, and after like 10 seconds Charlie said, fine. Justin and I couldn't help but look down to see what he had written, and what we saw was disturbing. It was basically just a jumble of numbers, x's, parts of graphs, and other things we couldn't make out. This is where we really got concerned for Charlie's well-being. Justin and I asked him if something was bothering him, to which he replied, every of the x's. Then Justin suggested he take a break and visit with one of his family members. Of note, Charlie didn't have a roommate, so he lived alone in his dorm. Eventually Justin and I began strongly encouraging him to call his sister, who we'd mentioned in conversation before and who apparently had just graduated from our college. Charlie finally agreed to call her, or at least we thought he agreed, and Justin and I offered to walk Charlie back to his dorm. I'm not sure if Charlie really accepted our invitation, but we walked with him regardless. Charlie walked rather slow, and the trip back took around 15 minutes. We got to the door and he said thanks quietly, walked inside, and closed it. Justin and I were at a loss. After a brief discussion, we decided to call student services and let them know something might have been wrong with Charlie. The lady we spoke with on the phone didn't appear super concerned, and she said she'd pass along our message and someone would reach out to him, and then that was it. We weren't sure what else to do at the moment, so Justin walked back to his own dorm room across campus and I went back to my apartment. When I laid down to go to sleep that night, I figured it would have been best to exchange phone numbers with Charlie so he could let me know if he was in trouble, and I could also call him to see how he was doing. After more thinking, I decided to go by his dorm once a day to check on him, at least until I was sure his sister or student services was aware of how he was doing. I'm an older student and was still working part-time, but luckily my apartment and job were both nearby and it wasn't that much of a hassle. The next day I went by Charlie's dorm, only to see that the door was left open. "Charlie?" I called. No one answered. I cautiously walked over and stuck my head inside and was immediately greeted by a foul odor. The dorm room was filthy. There were papers, clothes, and old food just strewn around the floor, and I didn't see Charlie. I called out for him again, and again no one answered. I gently pushed the door open, which cast light onto more of the filth, and then turned the light switch on. I won't mention some of the other things I saw in Charlie's room, but suffice it to say they made me even more concerned for Charlie's well-being. After determining Charlie wasn't anywhere in that room, I went to the little office area near the front of the dorm. I explained the situation to a girl who I think was an RA, and she became concerned as well. We walked back to Charlie's dorm, and she gagged as the odor met her face. We called campus security to report that Charlie might be in danger, and waited at the dorm until they showed up. A few minutes later, an actual cop showed up as well. They did a thorough search of his room. Again, I'll spare more of the details. Then an actual campus-wide search was conducted. Eventually they found him. He was just pacing back and forth across one of the floors in one of the buildings, mumbling to himself. I'm not sure if he had any classes in that building, but regardless, there was no way he could care for himself, and he was in imminent danger. I'm pretty sure they took Charlie to the hospital for a mental evaluation after that. However, I never saw him again. Later on, I told Justin and some of the other people in our study group what happened, and they were shocked. Justin and I looked things up after the fact, and we strongly suspect Charlie had started to suffer from schizophrenia. Based on what we read, that can cause someone to become disorganized, have trouble talking and walking, and become unable to care for themselves. I'm just glad that I decided to check on Charlie the day after Justin and I walked him home, because who knows what would have happened to him if he hadn't been taken to the hospital right then. If anyone listening to this story knows someone who may be exhibiting those signs, please try to get that person help. They might not be able to do it on their own. And wherever Charlie is now, I just hope that he's getting the help he needs.